democracy. I want to briefly introduce our guests, although they may not require introductions for many of you, but I would like to briefly introduce them before we delve into a conversation about the topics of today, leaving then a space and time for your questions to our guests. So to my left, Claudia Lopez was mayor of Bogota from 2020 to 2023 with the Green Alliance Party. She holds a PhD in political science from Northwestern University and an MA in public administration from Columbia University, and is currently a visiting scholar at Harvard and was before also a visiting scholar at Yale. Prior to becoming mayor, Claudia was a national senator and ran in her party's primaries for the presidency of Colombia. It's also worth mentioning that perhaps the way in which Claudia came into public life was through a very influential student movement called the Séptima Papeleta movement in the late 80s, early 1990s, which was largely responsible for making the constitutional reform of 1991 in Colombia a reality. Through that movement, they included this informal ballot in the elections of 1988, if I recall correctly. And this constitutional reform became a reality, and one of the first, or the first, well, actually Brazil was 88, one of the first new constitutions of the democratization or third wave of democratization in Latin America. Very important reform and setting an example for the rest of the region. Mauricio Rodas was mayor of Quito, Ecuador, from 2014 to 2019 with the party Suma, which he founded. He holds an MA in government administration and another MA in political science, both from the University of Pennsylvania, and a doctorate in law from the Universidad Católica of Ecuador. Prior to being elected mayor of Quito, Mauricio worked at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, you may know the acronym, and advised local and state governments in Mexico. Mauricio is a member of the University of Pennsylvania community. We have the pleasure of having him teach at the Weizmann School of Design. So some of you may have taken courses with him or can take courses with him in the near future. Without further ado, we'll delve into the topic of today, which has to do with environmental challenges and how to finance them, basically, you know, how to confront them and challenge and finance them. But before we get into the specifics, I thought it would be good to start our conversation with a question that I would like to pose to both Claudia and Mauricio, and that has to do with what were two major unexpected opportunities and two major unexpected challenges that you faced during your time as mayors of these, you know, major Latin American cities, Bogota and Quito. And what did you learn from those experiences? Claudia, would you like to go first?
Well, thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here with Mauricio and with all of you. And Julia, thank you so much for having us. So I was mayor from 2020. I have the honor to be the first mayor, the first woman to be elected mayor of Bogota ever, and also the first diverse woman to be ever elected mayor in Bogota. So it was such a huge challenge, not only for me, but for many women throughout time participating in politics in Colombia. And a week after I started, the pandemic started. So COVID-19 was definitely an unexpected challenge that I had to face. And I will say not as unexpected as COVID, but huge impact that increased enormously precisely because of the poverty and all the consequences that COVID brought was immigration from Venezuela. So we have received in Colombia 2.5 million Venezuelans coming through. 600,000 of them are in Bogota. Of course, we are the largest city to receive more people. So at the moment in which we were not having the best economic situations, it's always a challenge. It has been happening like in the last decade. But I will say those challenges turn out to be in the short and more in the long term, I will say, huge opportunities both for Bogota and for Colombia. In terms of opportunities, I have to say, every time that I say, well, the pandemic started, everyone look at me like, oh yeah, poor woman, right? The pandemic. And I always said, look, the pandemic was the easiest part of the job. If you ask me now, 4 years after, the COVID-19 in itself, that was the easiest part of the job. At the end was a very huge challenge, the massive death of your people. That's the seriousness of the challenge. But it were the consequence. At the end was a huge challenge, one problem, because of fear or for trust or for a combination of both. People was in general willing to collaborate, to join efforts, to focus on that one problem, to follow new rules, very new rules every week almost. So, but then all the consequences that came after it, in a year, unemployment triples, poverty triples, insecurity grew, social unrest. So were all the consequences along the other 3 years after the pandemic. That was actually the challenge, leading with all that at the same time. But I will say that precisely because it was such a multi-crisis at the same time, touching almost every aspect of life in the city, it also gave us a room to maneuver, a room for innovation at the social, economic, and environmental level that probably in normal times we would have had. So it was, a sort of double edge, I would say. Now, precisely because of that, turning that into opportunities, that level of innovation, I would say the biggest opportunity for the topic of climate change and funding these new challenges that I had was we were able to align. And that was not because of the pandemic. I was just lucky that during my term I had a chance to do that. So the national government did the National Climate Change Plan and committed in the COP for decarbonization of Colombia by 2051, right? So now we, the cities, had to do the local and regional plan. So I had the opportunity to do that first plan for Bogota. That was a great opportunity. Second of all, I had the opportunity to finally, for those of you who know the history of Bogota, we have having this absurd discussion about public transportation, and particularly about the metro, whether or not to do it, where to do it, as a subway, as an elevator. 20 years of waste time and political nonsense. And finally, with my election, that nonsense stopped. Like there was a clear sign, massive, more than 65% of the people saying, we're gonna do the metro and the multimodal public transportation system, period. No more discussions about it. So that was a huge opportunity also. Like finally, after 20 years of discussion, we had the political support to move ahead. So that was good. And we will, and step further on that is not only doing the first metro line as it was already contracted out, but actually agreeing both with the national level, the city and the state level in one common long-term mobility plan for the city. And why is that important? Because 48% of the green emissions from Bogota came from the transportation sector. So really decarbonizing transportation, particularly public transportation to begin with, is like half of the solution, both for transportation, but also for climate change. So that was an opportunity. And then because of the pandemic, actually, we need to do an economic, like a new Green Deal for the 21st century, really, like Keynesianism in the 21st century. So I had the opportunity, I needed, and I agreed in a plan with the private sector, the national sector, the business community in the city. I did a tax reform during my period. It didn't cause social unrest. I have to say the national attempt to do a tax reform caused social unrest. But we were able to agree in the largest public investment plan for the city ever. 87 billion pesos, which is like $20 billion for 15 years, for 10 years plan. Mainly focus on building the multimodal public transportation system, but also on education and social infrastructure in the care economy, particularly care blocks for women caregivers, so on and so forth. So I would say the alignment of those three plans, the mobility plan, the public investment plan on the long term, and the climate change plan, that was the biggest opportunity that we had during my term to align these goals with the largest investment ever in the city to actually do it, not only plan it, but do it and execute it. So I would say that's sort of the answer to that first question.
Thank you so much. Mauricio, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tulia, for the kind invitation. It's great to be having this conversation with Claudia and you, and to be once again speaking here from home at the Perry World House. I would say one of the really pleasant, unexpected opportunities that I found is the willingness of the people of Quito back then, 2014, when I got to office, the willingness of the people of Quito to embrace a climate agenda. Because one would think that in a developing country, people would prioritize some other urgent needs, right? For me, climate is an urgent need, but in the view of many, having a city government prioritizing housing, water sanitation, education, safety, so on and so forth, should be the priority over a climate discussion. But I found that when you manage to use communications properly in terms of portraying climate, not only as climate, but as improving people's quality of life, then you change the whole situation and you change the narrative. Because people actually understand that by pursuing an ambitious climate agenda, at the end of the day, you're not only protecting the planet, but you're actually improving people's quality of life significantly. So once you explain things under that framework, you actually get people's support in a great way. So that was very, very pleasant to discover, because that enabled us to be very ambitious in our climate agenda if we kept, portraying it as a way to improve people's quality of life. And just like in the case of Bogota, we found that our largest CO2 emission source was our mobility system. One of the first things I did when I got to office was to measure that, where our emissions were coming from. And it turned out that 56% of our emissions were coming from our mobility system. So we obviously realized that it was there that we needed to focus our efforts on. And we decided to move ahead with the largest infrastructure project in the history of the city, which is the metro line. Now, having realized that we could get people's support to a climate agenda and to this kind of projects that address climate concerns, but at the same time, in the case of the metro, for example, improve people's, way of transporting from point A to point B, saving time, traveling in a safe, comfortable way, in a transformative transportation means that would not only improve the mobility system, but actually project the city to modernity, foster new economic activity around the station, so on and so forth. We were in fertile ground to promote such an initiative. But it wasn't the only one. We also, undertook ambitious projects, for example, when it comes to taking cars out of the streets. We pedestrianized the core area of Quito's historical district, which is the largest in Latin America. That was huge because, you know, at the beginning, many people were reluctant about doing this, particularly shop owners in the area, when actually turns out that, you know, taking cars out of the street and make streets pedestrianized improves, economic activity, and actually it is very good for shop owners, for tourist activity, so on and so forth. And we managed to reduce by 30% pollution levels in the historical district because of the pedestrianization project. We also, undertook a very aggressive move on declaring important areas of the district, the metropolitan district of Quito, as natural protected areas. So it happens that the metropolitan district of Quito is huge. It has 423,000 hectares, only 11% of which are urban. So most of our district territory is rural. And we managed to increase significantly the percentage of the district's territory under natural protected areas regulations up to 44%. Today, 44% of the metropolitan district of Quito are natural protected areas. And fortunately, we managed to raise population support to this kind of initiative. So again, that was really unexpected, I would say, but very pleasant to discover. Another very, positive aspect that I found that I really quite realized before I got to office is how strong the city's movement worldwide was. And again, we're talking 2014. Now it is much stronger, which is great. I was lucky enough to be the hosting mayor of Habitat 3, which was great for Quito because it put the city on the spotlight. And I would say that it made Quito particularly committed to comply with these international global agendas, the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda, the SDGs, so on, so forth, since we were hosting, Habitat 3, which, as you know, is the most important UN conference on urban sustainable development, which takes place every 20 years. So it is a big deal. And of course, that also helped Quito to become very active in different international spaces. So I think that we managed to really grasp that opportunity by, projecting Quito's vision in all of these global discussions in a very strong way, not only by hosting Habitat 3, but also by performing very active leadership roles in some of the most important city networks, C40, the Global Covenant of Mayors, ICLE, UCLG. But it was really great to find that, this international movement around cities was growing strong in terms of, advocating for having cities getting a seat at the global table. That was really exciting. And I think that really Quito took advantage of that opportunity. In terms of what were I wouldn't say these were unexpected challenges. I knew there was going to be challenges around these issues, but I have to say the main one for sure was the political blockade I suffered from the national government. And this is because I was not supposed to win the election. I was running against the incumbent mayor, who came from the same party as the back then President Rafael Correa, who was extremely popular at the time. He had 68% approval in the city of Quito. And his party mate, the incumbent mayor, was running for re-election. And I ended up winning actually for a large margin, which is something that the president maybe forgave me for. So, he was in power for 10 years. He had this very, I would say, authoritarian style. He was very close to back then President Hugo Chavez and that kind of leaders in the region. He controlled all the media. He controlled, in practice, all powers in the country. So, having the mayor of the capital city coming from a different party with a different view was really, really, really a challenge. And unfortunately, that was translated into practical aspects. I didn't have a majority in my city council, so governing with a majority that supported the president and the national government with all the power from the national government to blockade very important initiatives was tough. And again, that wasn't unexpected, but I must list this as the #1 challenge that I have to deal against. And in things like something that we were talking before this session, when it comes to, for example, financing the metro. To get finance for the metro, and now I get to the second top challenge that I had to face, the fact that cities confront an international financial system that was designed for countries, not for cities. It was designed in the 1940s, Bretton Woods, when the world was not nearly as urbanized as it is today. Now things have changed. Cities are at the forefront of dealing with the global most pressing issues. But unfortunately, they are not well equipped to do that because they don't have proper access to finance in a global financial architecture that is totally country focused. So when I wanted to finance my metro project, it turned out that I needed a national government's guarantee. Do you think that President Correa wanted to grant me a sovereign guarantee for my metro project? Of course not, right? So what do? And unfortunately, this is a problem that many mayors around the world confront with. It's not only about trying to do the right thing, because nobody questioned the fact that we needed to do something about our mobility system because 56% of our emissions were coming from it. But not only that, but because we had a terrible transportation system that we needed to improve. Okay, so we knew that we needed the metro. We studied different solutions. That was the one that we needed. So nobody questioned that. It wasn't a technical debate. No. It is unfortunate that in this case, like in many others in the world, cities are not allowed to do what they need to do because of politics. In this case, fortunately, we managed to get the sovereign guarantee. Why? Because we mobilized public opinion support in favor of the project. Going back to my first point, it was great to realize that people would embrace a climate agenda if you portray it as something that will improve people's quality of life. So that helped. And because of that, we managed to convince people that it was the right thing to do. And there was a point in which President Correa had no choice but to grant the guarantee to move ahead with the project. But that's something that cities shouldn't go through. I mean, if you think about it, more than 70% of CO2 emissions are taking place in cities. It is in cities where the battle against climate change will be defined. And for cities to do the right thing and to be effective in tackling climate, they need access to resources. So for me, it is scary to think that because of politics, in many cases, cities are not able to undertake these climate-related projects to become drivers in the battle against climate change. It is scary that politics are stepping in the way. So again, we were lucky to find a way to overcome that particular challenge, but unfortunately, that's not always the case, and we shouldn't rely on luck to do the right thing.
Thank you very much. I guess there is a reason why we political scientists study politics. You can see how relevant it is. More seriously, Claudia, I would like to know, you were mayor more recently. How do you think Bogota is preparing for the environmental challenges of the 21st century? You mentioned the metro, which is an important way of cutting on CO2 emissions. What are other plans? And in particular, could you talk to us about this idea that you have about macro regions and about the importance of macro regions to partially address these environmental challenges?
When I was deciding whether or not to compete to be the mayor, I asked my team and myself, I said, what are the 5 things that, I have to say Bogota has had, with one exception maybe. Since 1988, we elect popularly mayors. And I will say that we have had fantastic mayors. with one exception. There are measures from the right, from the left, independents, but in general, good measures, each of them with its own emphasis. This to say that this is not a city in which you can improve things just because things are so bad that whatever you do is going to be better. No. So the bar is high. And I decided, well, I want to do, I'm the daughter of a teacher, so I'm going to do something really different and new and meaningful for particularly tertiary post-secondary education, which, by the way, is not a function of the city. This is supposed to be a national thing. But there is no way we can improve the life, the education, the job opportunities for the new generations if we are not getting involved on it. So I decided to cover that issue and to put money on it and invest heavily in post-secondary education. I'm the first woman ever to be elected, so I want to do something minimal for women. And one of the things that I decided to do is, let me give you this figure, 4.5 million of the 8 million inhabitants of Bogota, we are women. 1.2 million of them are full-time caregivers. Not surprisingly, 700,000 of them are in poverty because care is this industry that allow all the rest of the industries and the economy to function. But when 52% of your economy is informal, meaning people don't have a minimum salary, a pension fund, a health reform, who provides that care? We're all going to be kids at some point. We're going to be elders at some point. We're going to eventually get sick at some point. We may have some disability. Who gets that care? Who offers that care? Women offer that care for free. This is an industry. The care economy is this economy in which most of the labor force works for free, which doesn't happen in any other industry. This is unfair to women, of course. We have sacrificed education, health, job inclusion, autonomy, freedom to become sort of the social security system of a large part of our society. And this is, of course, mainly related not to an economic issue, not to a political issue, but that's a cultural issue. It's a society based on machismo and patriarchalism, and we assume this is the normal thing. So me, as the first woman, said, guess what? This is not normal. We're going to denormalize that. We're going to find ways to relieve, first of all, to recognize this fact. Second of all, to reduce and redistribute unpaid care work from over the shoulders of women to other members of their families or the city or the private sector. And our main creation for that were the care blocks for women caregivers. I will mention that. And then the metropolitan area. The fourth thing that I wanted, the metropolitan transport system. The fourth thing that I wanted to do was the master urban land use plan. As much as the metro, almost during the same period, 17 to 20 years, the city was unable to agree to approve both the metro and the land use plan. So the master urban land use development plan of the city is supposed to be upgraded every 10 years, has passed almost 20, and the city has been able to approve that. Two mayors tried to approve the metro, they couldn't. Two mayors tried to approve in the city councils the master urban land use plan, they couldn't. And that has implications for climate change. And the fifth was the metropolitan region. So I will came at for what I think was incredibly important. So why the land use plan was important? Because it is about deciding how much land we will use for what purpose, what land we will use for protection and environmental purposes, how long we will use for urban services and purposes, and how to distribute that land, and how to use it, how to capture value from that land. Of course, it's a very contingent element. I always said, look, a master urban land use plan, it seems a norm, it seems a law, it seems paper, but every single letter in that paper could mean hundreds of millions of dollars in favor of against some activity. So of course, a very contingent issue. We were able to align the climate change plan, as I said, the transportation plan, the investment plan, and the land use plan, which we finally approved during my term. And because of the pandemic, as Mauricio was saying, cities are becoming much more important on the international stage. But because of the pandemic, much more. It's like suddenly the world and every citizen around the world, regardless of the country, realize that mayors matters, right? That's the one who's going to give you the instructions of what to do, where to get the vaccines, how to organize the hospitals, whether or not to do quarantine. So suddenly the world realized, oh, by the way, these mayors matter, man, right? And it gave us a lot of clout, more clout than before, after the process of the UN Habitat 3 that Mauricio was mentioning. But then this idea that we have to share across municipal boundaries, institutions and rules to decide, for example, on traffic, on transportation, on housing, on public utilities, has been there for more than 50 years. In the United States, in Latin America, different cities has metropolitan areas, which is basically mean looking at what municipalities are sort of conurbanized, have sort of functional regions relations, and try to agree on some rules to manage those metropolitan areas. Yet, when it comes to climate change challenges, I will say that's not even the most perspective seen. I mean, the most important thing is not how traffic is and how we're going to solve traffic. The most important things we're going to need to decide is not traffic, is not housing, is not public utilities, is food security, is water, is energy. So that's where the idea of these macro regions came about. And I've been pushing for that institutionalization in that perspective is, look, before asking where is the traffic caused by cars, let's ask where my water, the water of Bogota is coming from where? It's not coming from the top. I mean, it gets there from some point. Whoever is the mayor in those areas, that's my best friend. Because the day Bogota doesn't have water, there will be civil war. Okay? The same with energy. And that's precisely what climate change is putting pressure and putting under risk because of the alteration of the climate cycle. It's water provision, it's energy provision, and it's food. We may fabric chips in factories. That's not the case for food. We need land, rural land, peasants, people who actually do this. So it doesn't make sense when you think in that perspective, the space is no longer just the vicinity of the municipality who you have in traffic with. It's a different spatial approach. So it happens, I came in with this idea of the metropolitan area. And I suddenly, almost the first year, because of the pandemic, even the pandemic, I mean, I remember my president didn't want to sort of take the lead in the pandemic. So I agree with the governor of Cundinamarca, who is my partner in reality, in practical terms. All the vicinities surrounding Bogota belong to the Cundinamarca state. We are one out of the 116 municipalities of the Cundinamarca state. Half of our food is grown in the Cundinamarca state. All the sources of water between at least 25 Cundinamarca municipalities and Bogota is the same source. All the electric cables that supply energy for Bogota at the same time supply energy for Cundinamarca. So by far we are in this together. And he was not from a same political party, whatever, but I approached him with this approach, and I was lucky enough, I have to say, that even though we didn't become from the same party, or even we were opponents, apparently, we both agree that we need to work together in these issues. So that's where the idea of this more region-based rather than just urban metropolitan-based came into being. And we're starting to work on that. We include that because we did the land use master plan. So the same thing as Quito. And I think that's the serious decision. You want to know how serious a mayor is with that? Require the land use plan. If that plan is still suburbanizing and increasing suburban sprawl, there is no way that's going to be a climate change consistency. There is no way you're going to achieve the sustainable development goals through urban sprawl. That's absolutely unsustainable. I have to say, with all due respect, that the very proof of that is this country. The United States only accounts for 350 million people around the world. But the way the urbanization and the industrialization of the United States consume 25% of the planet. If Latin America would do the same, in India do the same, if China do the same, there is no way we can survive. That's simply unaffordable from the natural resource point of view. So we need to do things differently. And the same way that Quito did. The first decision that we took in Bogota Master Urban Land Use Plan was, we're not going to consume more environmental or rural land, period. We cannot keep destroying ecosystemic, very valuable land. Instead of that, we increase in 30% the rural and ecosystemic area protected under the new land use plan. That was a huge discussion with the building sector, for example. Say, oh, no, you're going to stop housing development in Bogota. And he said, no, guess what? You have the technology. You can use vertical land. We're plenty of them. We still can group vertically, but horizontally, consuming more waterlands, more rivers, we cannot do that. So that's a decision is tough. It's easier to say than to do, but that's crucial for sustainable development. Second, protecting environmental land by 30% or by 40% as you did in Quito is protecting water resources. That's what you are actually protecting outside of the city. I don't know where the water of Quito came from. Where the water of Bogota came from for 70% of the rural land. 70% of Bogota's land. Bogota, you visit Bogota. Bogota is a large city. All that large urban city that you see, that's just 30% of Bogota's actual territory. 70% of Bogota's actual territory is urban, is rural, and is a municipality which was included into the city called Sumapaz. And Sumapaz to Chingasa is a long chunk of territory in Bogota, and in Cundinamarca is the largest paramount water land in the world. Even though Bogota is 2,600 meters above the level of the sea, in the middle of the Andes, right? You see Bogota, you say, why the hell they put the capital city right there? It's like, we're 500 kilometers from the near coast. We're 2,600 meters above the level of the sea. We have 3 huge top mountains. We are right in the middle of the 3. What the hell? Well, because it was by colonial times a lot healthier than to be in Cartagena. A lot healthier. Welcome to the tropic. Even now is a challenge in terms of health. And also because above us, 4,500 meters above the level of the sea, is this marvelous Sumapaz, Chingasa, waterland, paramount. So the clean water just drip into the city. The day in which we have to bump up water for the Magdalena River, 2,600 meters above Bogota, Bogota disappeared. It's simply unfeasible to do that, right? So we better care, all these macro region who's above us. We share it with Cundinamarca mainly, like 70% of the area is between Cundinamarca, a little bit less, like 70% of the area. There is another like 40, almost 30% in Meta, which is a neighboring governor. It's not a municipality, it's a state, Meta. And roughly the 10% is between Boyacá, Huila, and Tolima. So those five governors, they are my best friends. If they don't take care of the Sumapaz Chingasa paramount, we're done. Period. We're done. And guess what? Those five governors, Cundinamarca, in terms of food, provide half. And like 30% of the rest of the food come from the other four states that I mentioned. And the same with the energy. The energy is much more closely related between three of us, Meta, Cundinamarca, and Bogota. So you think in terms of food security, water security, and energy security, which are the three challenges, the three things that are being pressured by climate change. That's the level of space that you need to coordinate. And we better go into that level quickly and effectively. This is not, to do PPTs and plans that are going to be in the bookshelf that nobody's going to care, just publish, but not actually execute. We don't have time. So we better create governance effective at this level to deal with these challenges. And that's what became the metropolitan region, Bogota, Cundinamarca, at least. So to make a long story short, in the sake of time, I took that priority and said, well, now really, we need to create the Bogota, Cundinamarca, governance institutions for that. But to make a long story short, we need to change the constitution to do that. This is a Colombian story. I'm not going to get into that, but for some political, legal reason, Bogota was not even allowed to create a metropolitan area. Nonsense, but we have 7 metropolitan areas in Colombia. The one that actually works is the second largest city of Colombia, Medellin, has the best metropolitan areas called the Valle de Aburrá, is cited as the best example, one of the best examples in Latin America of metropolitan areas, so on and so forth. What's the distinction between the metropolitan area in Colombia and the metropolitan region? First of all, metropolitan areas are about municipalities in Colombia. The governors are not there. The states are not there. So the metropolitan regions include the governor and state. Bogota is a district capital, but at the same time is like a state. So it can combine the district capital, and state, and municipalities. 3 different levels of authorities. Second of all, it won't be elected. And that was a decision that I made with the governor. I said, look, decentralization in Colombia, as you know, Tulia, political decentralization in Colombia, in general Latin America, is municipal driven. Decentralization means going to the municipal level. And yeah, the closest, the best, but it's also the weakest. Not necessarily the best resources, the best technical capacity, the best investment capacities at that level. So instead of electing a new figure by popular vote, we already elect the mayor, we already elect the governor, creating a third position of electoral, an electoral position will increase the political competition, and all this story that Mauricio was mentioning before. So we said, no, we're not going to create an electoral body, we're going to create an administrative body. It's specialized in agreeing things and in executing. It's not about political competence. It's not about electoral competition. And the third thing is how to fund it. Before going into the fund, the third thing is, what do we want them to specialize in? So we decided by the creation of the metropolitan region to create 2 agencies. Agencies in Colombia is sort of public-private, more flexible, more execution capacity type of administrative body that you can have according to Colombian law, just to summarize. So 2 agencies, one for mobility and transportation, because as I said, the other half, when you account for water, energy, and food, what follows in terms of the climate change plan? Transportation. So a metropolitan regional authority of transportation that not only invest in the infrastructure, but coordinate the actors, the common funding, the common operation, the common rules. Because otherwise I'm going to have one metro and then the next is going to have its own BRT and the other one is going to have its own buses and the other one is going to have its own regional train. And who coordinates that into one authority, one operational system, one ticket system? There has to be an authority to do that. So the metropolitan region of Bogotá, Cundinamarca has one authority for transportation and mobility and one authority for food security and economic development. And the metropolitan region in itself will do hierarchical guidelines for environmental land use that has to be enforced across all the region. And the funding, finally. So the finance of this, how to fund it. So to make this possible, we need to change the constitution, did a law. Then the city council needs to approve the inclusion, for example, of Bogotá into the metropolitan region. The assembly of the state has to approve the incorporation of the Cundinamarca state. So if we take away any function or money that is already in the hands of municipalities or governors, this won't be feasible. They will resist, of course. They don't want to surrender functions or money that they have. So instead of causing that clash, we create 3 new sources for the funding of the region. One is national thing. Instead of fighting among us for functions, we use the metropolitan region as a figure for decentralization, for additional decentralization tooling, not only at the municipal and local level. Now, functions, for example, let me tell you something that simple. What is the municipality or the city which is in the vicinity of Philadelphia? The closest, the one you have more relationships with. Let's suppose, New York and New Jersey, right? And you cross, the river, something like that. So just now suppose there is no river, it's really on a street. Here it finishes Bogotá, there it starts Funza, another municipality. To put, even if we both agreed, both mayors, to put a new bus lane to start in Funza and coming to Bogotá, have to ask permission for the Ministry of Transportation. It's like, what the hell? Why do I have to go to the national level to do this, even if we agree? There is a huge level of decentralization in many common sense things. So what the agreement was, look, we're going to decentralize functions and money from the national level into the metropolitan region. So many functions regarding food security, regarding transportation, regarding traffic, regarding housing, regarding environment that were at the national level, we move that into the region. Second, money. Every year, the national government has to put in their budget an allocation for the region, which is like 70,000 million pesos, which is like, I would say, $15 million or so. So it's not huge, but some. That's the second source. And third, we can put an overhead or up to 2% into the vehicle tax in all the region to support the transportation authority. And we could put also 1 or 2 additional points in the land tax, which is municipal, to fund the region. So that's the scheme. We were able to do the constitutional reform in 2021, then the law in 2022. In 2023, Bogotá City's Council approved the inclusion of Bogotá into the region. Cundinamarca Assembly approved the inclusion. and another municipality, which is Soacha, which is the largest of Cundinamarca, approved to enter into the metropolitan region. So it's a new process, it's a new figure. But wherever the figure is, I really think is an absolutely survival kind of decision to find out, to define, to put in place, to allocate resources and authority into these kind of regional bodies that ultimately force us to plan ahead, to invest collectively in the challenges of food, water, energy, mobility, public security, public utilities, security, transportation. It has 7 issues in which the metropolitan region has to work on.
I have a last question for Mauricio before we open it up to the public. So I don't know if Quito has experimented with a similar governance structure that is macro city level and it's regional. But regardless of whether you have it or not, I think one of the challenges that cities have is how to finance their projects. You talked about the climate agenda. We heard about food security, water security, energy, transportation, immigration. So there are all these different programs that cities must address and finance. So in your experience, what are the shortcomings of the national systems when it comes to revenue sharing and perhaps also financing of public expenditures?
Well, one of the main problems in, I would say, most of Latin American cities is their high dependence in governmental transfers to finance their budgets. Right? In the case of Quito, around 42% of our budget comes from governmental transfers, which unfortunately are always frequently politicized. I mean, that money doesn't always get there on time, which has huge implications in terms of your planning and execution of projects, because if you don't have the money available, then how do you pay contractors to do things, right? So that's a problem, which would be not as concerning if cities would have some other alternatives. Of course, one of which is improving their tax collection capacity, which is, of course, something that many cities in the region have to work a lot on, and we need to acknowledge that. But also, I think that if cities would have some kind of more autonomous or autonomic mechanism to access finance internationally, that would alleviate their dependency on national government transfers. And I go back to the point of, unfortunately, cities are navigating an international financial system that was designed for countries and not for cities, which again has huge implications on many of what cities can do. What to do about that? How to change that reality? I think that we need to take advantage of this growing movement on raising the importance of cities at the global stage and local authorities at global discussions. Because part of the discussion, how to get cities a seat at the global table of agendas and discussions moving forward should be around finance. How do we reform the international finance system to make it more cities friendly? Only 44% of countries in the world allow cities to borrow. That means that in the other 56% of countries in the world, cities are legally banned to international borrowing, which is terrible. Now, in the case of the 44% of countries where cities are allowed to borrow, in many cases, they need a national governance guarantee, like in the case of Ecuador, to access, credits from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, so on and so forth, which, by the way, was the source of funding for the metro. We got funding from 4 multilateral banks simultaneously to build the metro. But for that, we needed a national government guarantee, which, as I mentioned before, many times is not granted because of political rivalries. So what to do about this reality? And this is something that we are working on here at Penn. Last year, we launched what's called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance. Penn holds the secretariat of this commission, which is co-chaired by the mayor of Paris, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is the president of Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This commission gathers mayors from around the world, representatives from international financial institutions, academics, to explore reforms to the global financial architecture to make it more accessible to cities. And one of the initiatives we're currently working on is precisely the setting up of a Green Cities Guarantees Fund, which will become an alternative mechanism, alternative guarantees mechanism for cities, so as to having them not being solely dependent on the national government guarantee. So you would say, hey, but what about the case of those countries in which cities are legally forced to get a national government guarantee to access finance? That's like in Ecuador, Quito it's legally forced to get this national sovereign guarantee to access finance. There are ways around that, and one of which is the possibility of accessing finance not directly through the city, but through municipally owned utility companies. So for instance, in the case of Quito, it was through the Quito's municipal utility water and sanitation company that we accessed a credit from the French Development Agency without a sovereign guarantee. But the fact of having a guarantee, any kind of guarantee, is important because it improves the term conditions with which you're accessing them. So that's why this idea of coming up with a city-dedicated, a city-focused guarantees fund makes sense, because it would help many cities around the world to access finance in better terms. If they are mandated as the only chance to get funding, to get a national sovereign guarantee, they can always access finance through their municipally owned utility companies or through the private sector investing in urban projects. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter who manages the project as long as these projects are developed in cities. These climate resilient projects are developed in cities. It doesn't matter whether they come from the city directly or from a utility company or from the private sector, as long as things get done. So this is a project in which we are currently working on right now. We think that it would unlock access to finance for many cities around the world. And this is the kind of reforms that I think we should be promoting going further. The current system is simply unsustainable. Countries will never be able to meet the Paris Agreement and their NDCs without an effective role from cities. But cities need to get access to finance to do this, because nowadays it is impossible to fund this is the amount, between 4.5 and 5.4 trillion dollars per year. That's the amount needed to turn current urban infrastructure into a climate resilient one. Under the status quo, it will be impossible for cities to finance this amount. So we need to make significant changes in the international financial system, and that's the kind of discussion that I think we should keep fostering moving forward.
I'd like to open it up now to the audience. I'm sure there must be questions. I would like to ask that you please briefly introduce yourself and tell us whether your question is for Claudia, for Mauricio, or for either of them. Do we have a mic? Yes. So if you don't mind coming there, because I believe we have people online, right? Yeah. So do we have people online? Yeah. So then in that case, we'd like to ask to please stand by the mic so they can hear your question. Would you like to go first? Thank you. And feel free to do a line.
Okay, yes, it's working. Thank you so much. My name is Lucas Martins. I am a PhD candidate from Temple University's History Department. I'm always curious about mayors because one of the big things about them is because they get elected. And in order to get elected, you need to convince voters to vote for you. And we know that in Latin America, the big challenge that we have is all about populism, caudillismo, and all of that. And specifically, as we talk about researchers, scholars like both of you, how do we make sure that people like us, people like everyone in this room, I guess, how do we convince voters and meet voters where they are? I think that's really challenging as we talk about Latin American politics.
Would you like to take the question, Claudia?
That's actually one of the issues that we are working with Steve Levitsky at Harvard, which is how do we actually elect against populism in Latin America successfully. And I have to say, in my experience, as the rise of populism has different causes. I was in a panel about populism in APSA in Philly this weekend. But I would say there are at least three factors that we need to take into account. So there are two challenges or causes that has not been properly addressed in the region: structural inequality and structural insecurity. And after the wave of democratization in the region in the 1990s, mainly, so that the promise of security of democracy was to fulfill the change on those structural challenges. And even though we have improved to some extent in some, particularly in the inequality and in the economic growth, in the insecurity, we haven't. We are 9% of the population of the world in Latin America, but we account for 33% of the rate homicide in the world. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. So I think we are all, people, Democrat people throughout Latin America may be worried about Bukele's model. But we need to come up with a different offer, effective offer to deal with the challenge. Otherwise, people will just move onto whoever offers sort of short-term solutions. That's one reason. I think the third factor influencing that is the uneven of stateness and democracy in the region. I mean, there are vast sectors of our territories who are not effectively controlled in terms of protection or inclusion by the state. So we have strong armed criminal competitors replacing the state role for that. And for many, let's say guerrillas existed for 60 years in Colombia, and mainly the elites thought that was not too much of a problem until those guerrillas started actually sucking them out and extorting them and kidnapping them. But when they did the same to a fifth of the population, nobody cares. It was just until it became an elite trouble, right? An urban trouble, then we finally care. So, as I always said, emptiness, vacuum, is something that exists in physics, but not in politics. If there is a challenge, unevenness of a stateness, of security, of inclusion that you're not taking care of, somebody else will take care of. So I will end up saying that I come from sort of a center, more independent party in Colombia. Both the right of Álvaro Uribe, to mention a name, or the left of Gustavo Petro is my opposition by definition, both of them. So I have to always, when I compete electorally, have to outcompete the right and the left. And if we want to be not only successful in elections, but meaningful in democratization and state building and change, we need to be serious about the delivery. Having a platform that is democratic, but meaningful and effective enough to convince people that because of our record, as I always said in Colombian terms, what makes the center different from the far right or the far left? Well, first of all, we never kill anybody. We didn't organize guerrillas or paramilitary groups. That's quite a difference. you guys have to kill each other and created against each other to destroy each other. That's quite a difference. We never robbed anybody. You have been governing here for far right, at least for 20 years, the right in general for 100. And the level of corruption in Colombia is simply unbeatable. We cannot resist this. So that's quite a difference. And third, there is a reason why we are scholars. I mean, we believe in science, in facts, in rigor in order to do public policy. It may limit what we offer. We don't want to, take people for granted or promise things that we cannot deliver. And it takes time to educate the public about that and the electorate, but I think that precisely because they are offered all sorts of things that will never ever be able to actually comply with. At the end, after a couple of cycles, people start realizing that, it will be less popular and fancy, but maybe may comply and deliver. So I will keep those things in mind when competing against populism in Latin America.
I would like to jump on that as well. So, I think that nowadays we are confronting into this, in Latin America, into this kind of left wing versus right wing kind of debate, which for me is absolutely obsolete, right? Where for me, really the question is whether we are or not populist. Convinced by the fact that you can be populist either coming from the left or coming from the right. I mean, for me, Chavez is as much of a populist as Fujimori, right? Or as Menem, who was also a populist, right? So for me, really, the debate shouldn't be about left or right, but whether you are populist or responsible. That's actually the wording that we use at our political party. How can we set up a responsible government model? And what do you define as responsible? Understanding that responsibility is the antithesis of populism. And I don't care whether you come from the left or from the left or from the right, as much as you are populist, just as much as I don't care whether you come from the left or from the right, as long as you are responsible. And I think you can find examples of responsible rulers in Latin America, some more leaning towards the left or the right. But that shouldn't be the parameter to measure things on. So what does responsibility means? What responsibility means, first of all, respecting democracy, respecting the rule of law. In a region like Latin America, I think that responsible government must have poverty alleviation as a priority, given the reality in which our region lives. Of course, having responsible ways to tackle crime and violence. We are witnessing now how populist approaches to tackle crime can be very dangerous for democracy, very dangerous for the institutions. So, and the question is how you make sure that responsible candidates are elected, right? And I think that is pretty much about telling the truth. And I think that people are becoming more and more aware of that, right? We have suffered so much from populist regimes in our region. And unfortunately, seems that in many places that keeps being the case. But I think that we should keep trying. And I think that it is not about becoming technocrats, because I think that a responsible ruler should, and a responsible politician should feel what people feels, but also, having a responsible procedure for policy making, right? By looking at, of course, technical standards, but never forgetting about the reality people live in our region. And that's why social policies should be at the forefront of any governmental agenda. And when I mention about climate, it's because I think that they are very closely related. I don't think that climate is any more a luxury to address for any government in the world. Because at the end of the day, it's about saving people's lives. Whenever I asked about, hey, how should we convince mayors to undertake resilient agendas? If a resilient agenda is not visible, it doesn't give you votes, which is true. But on the other hand, if you don't undertake a resilient agenda in your city, and all of a sudden a natural disaster hits and many people are killed because of that, that's really politically unprofitable for someone. So even if you're thinking about politics, you should be thinking about doing the responsible thing to do, because that will protect people's lives. There's nothing more popular than protecting people's lives. So at the end of the day, whether you call it politically profitable or responsible, it is about doing what you need to do and what you know is right. And for me, nowadays, linking the climate agenda with the social agenda is unavoidable. They are closely linked. They are absolutely related, and that's something that politicians should take into account in a planet that is much more exposed to natural disaster because of the effects of climate change.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much for all of this. This is really exciting and interesting. My name is Kathy. I work at the Center for Latin American Latinx Studies, but I teach a little bit about participatory democracy. And I was wondering if you could just maybe elaborate or give more examples of that, like the classic examples like participatory budgeting. But while you were mayor, did you see robust citizen participation, or did you promote it, or your administration? For instance, in the case of Quito, did people participate in getting, for instance, the national guarantee for international financing that you talked about for the metro, or in the case of Colombia, that people participate, right, in creating the metropolitan area, or in some other policy? And then finally, if you want to give an example, did you find when there was more robust citizen participation, did that help the policy outcome or maybe hurt it? Thanks so much. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, could I ask the three of you to come to the mic? We'll collect these three questions and then give you a chance to respond and then wrap up.
So give the question now.
Yes, please.
So this is for, well, I'm Grayson Forster. I'm an undergraduate student here at Penn, and this was for Mayor Rodas. So the city I'm from, Atlanta, Georgia, has like a fully financed public transit expansion plan. But the problem is that it cannot be built. The projected costs keep getting higher and higher, with the scope getting smaller and smaller. So as I understand it, Quito has recently delivered its metro line and it's in operation. How did the city get shovels in the ground and get the project delivered quickly and relatively affordably? Is it state capacity or is it something else?
Hello, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. My name is Lalita Kamath, and I'm a Fulbright Fellow here from India. Fulbright Fellow at Penn, I should say, in the anthropology department. But so I actually had a question for each of you. For Claudia, I was wondering, I think it's an amazing effort, I think, to do this environmental macro regions, and something I think all cities can learn from. And I was curious, did you actually draw in any way from indigenous ways of thinking of perspectives in Colombia or elsewhere in Latin America? And the reason I'm asking this is also because I think the kind of divisions we have in terms of urban or rural or municipal, or these kinds of jurisdictions are very much artificial, created, constructed ones. And so can we then think of perspectives that maybe then can then transcend these kinds of divisions? And so that's why I was thinking of indigenous. And for you, Mauricio, I'd be really interested in, I was fascinated by the focus on this commission, this idea of greening cities, and this new fund that you're thinking of as a mechanism also to strengthen cities. But I'm just wondering also if there are some tensions here with democracy. And again, this is largely from my own experience with Indian cities. We have a lot of municipal utilities, agencies, but which have nothing to do, they only operate and function in the city. They have very little to do with reporting to the city, or they're certainly not elected officials. In many cases, they are agencies that we call parastatal, but they're non-elected. Sometimes they are boards or they are corporations of different sorts. They typically report to the provincial or the regional level, or sometimes the national level, but they operate in the jurisdiction of the city. And so a lot of our municipal services actually are done by these agencies. So I think at one point you said something like, it's important that the project gets done. It matters less who runs or manages this project. And so I think this has been, in fact, very much the approach in Indian cities, that a lot of these kinds of projects actually run by agencies, but where the city does not control these agencies at all. And it has caused a whole set of new problems. And so I think if you can maybe comment on, in a more abstract sort of way, about this tension then that you could potentially have with democracy, that I would be really interested. Thank you so much.
Okay, last two questions.
Hi, my name is Federico Ramirez. I'm actually from Bogota, Colombia. So I had the privilege of experiencing your administration and also that of Enrique Peñalosa. I'm a student at Penn and I'm majoring in urban studies in great part because I was so inspired and I saw all the change that our city has undergone. My question is for Claudia. Your administration was a trailblazer in sustainable urban planning in Latin America. However, it was also credited for abandoning or adjusting the Sendero de las Mariposas. This was a macro park in Bogota's eastern mountains, these huge, lush mountains in Bogota. Given that Bogota citizens have limited access to green spaces and the city is densely built, as a Bogota citizen myself, I'm curious about your views on where we should draw the line between preserving nature but also allowing people direct access.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Ernesto Gamauf, and I am a student at Penn. And I just had a quick question for both of you. Like, were there any issues or programs that you would have liked to continue working on, or was there anything that you were not able to finish, that if you still had more time as mayor, you would continue to work on?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mauricio, why don't you go first?
Okay, the question on the metro. Let me tell you briefly how the model worked, because it actually was quite innovative back then, and it worked pretty well. We were following closely some other examples in the region, including the one in Bogota, where you have been discussing the metro project for like 50 years or so. So I mean, we understood that metro projects are very complex, very complex. Many people advised me not to embark on that project, by the way. But I was convinced that it was a transformative project for the city, and we had to do it. And I am still convinced it will transform the city. So the first thing we did is to analyze whether this was financially sustainable or not. And we only decided to go ahead with the project when we hired the metro company from Paris to come to the city and give us a second opinion, because we already had one, on the financial model for ticketing and how much of a subsidy will we need. And it turned out that, given the fact that energy is very cheap in Ecuador and labor is cheap, with a fairly cheap ticket price of 45 cents, the metro could run without operational subsidy. So the capex is, of course, there. You're not going to recover the capex ever, but you shouldn't subsidize operations with a 45 cents per dollar ticket, which was great news. So once we were convinced about that, we decided to go ahead. As mentioned, we had the funding from 4 multilateral banks: the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, and CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, which is unusual. Normally you have 1 or 2 working together. Here we had 4, which made the project very complex because we have to fulfill policies from 4 different institutions, right? And not only that, but this is something that we decided to do, which is we decided to make the bank's policies the ones applicable to the project as opposed to national law. This would sound curious, but we actually used a legal provision in Ecuador that was never used before, that allows a project that is financed from multilateral organizations like these 4 banks to implement their policies instead of national law, which was great. Why? Because the bank's policies, which were much stricter than Ecuadorian law in many regards. When it comes, for example, to environmental safeguards while constructing the project, transparency criteria and requirements that you needed to comply with, social safeguards that you needed to comply with. So following those regulations made the project much more difficult to implement, really tough. But at the end, it was very worthwhile. Why? Because by following their policies, the project worked perfectly. We built a 22-kilometer line in 3 years. We comply with the budget and with the calendar, which is something unusual when you build your home. Not to say when you build a 22-kilometer underground project, you don't know where you're going to find underneath. So usually these projects don't comply with the calendar. We did. So we're really proud about the fact that the banks actually portrayed the Quito's Metro as one of their flagship projects because of this compliance, aspects. And that was great. Okay, we were really thrilled. I left office with 92% of the project ready, only after 3 years, and with trials being made with passengers, trains moving with passengers, as part of the trial stage. And it was planned for the metro to start commercial operations in 6 months after I left office. You know what happened? that's the nice side of the story. The sad part of the story is that it took 5 years for the metro to start its commercial operation after I left office. So we left it 92% ready. I mean, in this kind of projects, the hard part is the construction, because you don't know where you're going to be finding underneath, right? The easy part is to operate it once it's ready. Here it was the other way around. We left it ready, but it took 5 years, more than the time it took to build it. It took 5 years to operate it. Why? Because my successors, didn't follow the roadmap that was established for the operations. They changed the model a few times. One of those mayors was kicked out from office. Politics stepped on the way, so on and so forth. But the point is that, and going back to the question of what, you wish to do further, what would you like to get finished? Of course, I would have loved to inaugurate the metro 6 months after I left office. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And that tells you a story also about how difficult it is to give continuity to projects. I mean, and here we're talking about this huge infrastructure that was ready to be operated, and that didn't happen. And that implied a productivity cost for the city. I mean, the city invested a lot of money into this thing. So that's the sad part of the story. But the good part of the story now is that the project is working. People are really happy. You can see how the project is transforming the city in many regards. And it is interesting also how this kind of huge endeavors also become and should become an urban planning tool. In a city like Quito, a metro project is huge. It is really huge. So we thought how we can plan the city in a way around this huge infrastructure that we are investing so much money in, right? So for instance, we develop we started to plan the city to develop economic clusters around the stations, taking advantage of how many people will be moving around those stations, so on and so forth. We established new building codes around the stations because at the end of the day, we want to incentivize people to use public transport. That's at the end of the day, the whole point, right? So we wanted to incentivize buildings to grow taller in the areas around the stations for people to live there, to work there, to have everything nearby, and use public transportation. So we incentivize the purchasing of air rights in buildings as long as they comply with eco-efficient criteria when building. So we were allowed to do all these great things because we were implementing such a transformational initiative in city. And that's I think the way we should plan our cities towards the future, around transformative climate-related initiatives that would, most of all, improve people's quality of life.
Claudia, you have 2 questions at least to answer.
Yeah, so I will say time is never enough, but those are the rules. I think the institutional design in Colombia is particularly pernicious, I will say, because it has just 4 years, no re-election. You should either have re-election in a short period or a longer period with no re-election. But I think that's something structural for Colombia in general, not only for continuity, which is important, but for governance. Many things need at least meet long-term processes, and that maybe that's too short in the case of the Colombian case. Now, the participatory and the indigenous perspective, I would say, as you mentioned, for the indigenous perspective, this fantastic perspective, we have the cosmos, no boundaries at all. And it helps, yes, but at the same time, you have to deal with reality. That is, we are full of political and administrative boundaries. And so try to erase that, or try to build coordinations among them with different functions and capacities and resources, making sure of, I will say, less ambiguity. Who is in charge of? As long as there is less ambiguity in who's in charge of, so you can allow the citizenry and bodies, or the electoral bodies, or the citizens in general, to hold people accountable for what they are supposed to be in charge of. But the more ambiguity, the local level, the medium level, the regional level, the national level, we're all in charge of climate change. So who's ultimately in charge? If you cannot answer that question, that's a bad institutional design, because it prevents meaningful participation for people. They're going to participate with you to deliver what? Or to hold you accountable for delivering or not delivering what? So I will say that's pretty much about institutional design. I don't think we can just erase cross boundaries and come up to the way of thinking of the indigenous communities, particularly in urban areas. Maybe, in fact, in Colombia, in rural areas, we have granted indigenous rights and institutions, and those institutions and rules prevail upon indigenous land. So that's an advantage. But in the rural areas in which we don't have such large communities of such institutional design or law design, I think the coordination, less ambiguity, more accountability is the way to come up with. Now, I think, take me to the participatory thing. So I truly think, following this way of thinking, in Bogota, we have now in the region, Tulia and friends, for those of you who are interested in this topic, we have different examples in the region, which are actually meaningful for India. For example, I was just recently in India working for 2 weeks in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Bangalore. It was my first time in India. I came amazed of such an amazing country. But at the same time, I was telling them, look, I'm coming from a region who is already 80% urbanized. So let me tell you, what do we fail? Don't gonna repeat our mistakes. You can do it. 50% of the urbanization in India is still to happen. So you can learn a lot from our experience, both industrialization and urbanization. And the first thing I will say is, for us in Latin America, industrialization was the thing planned, and urbanization was something that happened in between, right? No. Urbanization is an industry. It should be part of your industrial policy. You should look at that. You're going to have, for example, in the case of India, India is promoting the sort of the new car decarbonized electrification industry, the automobile industry, other manufacturing industry. Well, guess what? The demand of decarbonization, the demand of decarbonized mobility, the demand of these, that's the demand you're going to have in cities. So you should see urbanization as an industry that is going to be agglomeratedly located, requires different things. For example, if you compare a factory to a sort of machines that you have right within a factory, land use planning, environmental planning, climate financing, those are sort of the machines you have in the factory of urbanization. So, and that's sort of the perspective in which you can also involve people in participatory budgeting. Is it useful or not? I will say it is always useful. It might do things hard, but also I think they are meaningful if people expect and know what they are going to participate. If you're just invited to give your opinion, and people should know that from the very beginning. Are you asking for an opinion? Are you asking for a decision? Are you asking for a financial contribution? What are you asking people for? I think that's the first rule, that participation is actually useful. And you can have different things, you know, just to participate in the co-design of a project is incredibly useful. There are many things that the best planner in the world, the most well-intended mayor in the world won't think about because people experience it for different perspectives. Just collecting those perspectives meaningfully and respectively and seriously is always useful. And so, for example, decided about the metro, to put an example, the metro, where the station should be, and so on and so forth. I will say, but that's not an open lottery, right? There are technical information that allow you to design, for example, where a station should be based on the demand, based on the origin and destination of the travels, so on and so forth. But the lower and the closer and the proximate things are to the community level, to the neighborhood level, the more participatory, even up to the point of decision making, it could be. So, for example, in the case of Bogota, we have this, at the same time, we are sort of the district, which in Colombian history was already a regional thing, because what is the territory of Bogota today is composed of 7 previous Cundinamarca municipalities. So it is already a sort of regional thing. But within the city, we are divided in 20 localities, right? According to the law, 10% of Bogota's budget should be distributed within the 20 localities. They have an appointed local mayor and an elected council, local council. So the local council and the appointed mayor, they decide what to do with the money. That was the rule of law before my term. What I said is, look, if you're in charge of, first of all, let's try to make these localities more homogeneous, because we have 20, but Candelaria, for example, is one of the 20. We have 50,000 inhabitants. But Suba is the other locality, and Suba has 1.5 million inhabitants. So let's try to make them a little bit more homogeneous, so we can put them in charge of something specific at a more homogeneous level. So the master urban land use plan decided that the 20 localities we won't have 20, but 33 localities, so that each locality is roughly about 350,000 people, right? To be more in charge of public space, parks, recreation, community-based activities, local improvement of public space, or stuff like that. And the third point, I decided to raise from 10 to 12% the amount of money that they got by law. It's not because I want to. I changed the law, so even if I'm not there, the next mayor have to do that, right? And the second thing that I decided is half of that budget of each locality will be decided in fully participatory budget, decision-making budgeting. So Community-based organizations propose the projects they want to execute. We in the mayor's office, we help them technically to improve the technicalities of the projects. And once we have all the technical projects approved, people by popular vote decide which projects we should fund. And the organization, the CBO, the community-based organization who proposed it, is the one who's going to be executing the project. So it's the whole process of participatory, from proposing, deciding, funding, and execution. Are they in charge of the metro? No, they are in charge of improving public space, gardens, cultural and sport and recreation things, after school projects, projects for taking care of the elders in the neighborhood, things that they can actually manage much, much better than us. And I'm absolutely proud of this. Of course, I was competing against Brazil, who is the #1 country record on participatory budgeting and in Latin America. And Oporto, who is this city who is well known for participatory budgeting. In the last year of my term, the 4th year, we're able to break the record of participation of votes. 700,000 people vote to decide in the 20 municipalities, in the 20 localities, what they were supposed to do. And finally, I will say this just to suggest, if you're interested in following this conversation. For the Sendero de las Mariposas, I don't want to leave that question unanswered. So this was a beautiful project, I have to say, in many senses, that Enrique Peñalosa proposed before me, who was building a trail, but was at the same time a road and a trail across the mountains surrounding Bogota. So it was too big for a trail and too small for a road. And we never were able to get the environmental licensing for the project. So the environmental authority didn't approve the project. It thought it was too heavy in infrastructure, and it may cause more damage at the environmental level than good. But because we are surrounded by these beautiful mountains, we were able to agree with that authority, even though we didn't do the Sendero de las Mariposas because we didn't have the environmental licensing to do an authority to do it. But we transformed that into a smaller red of trails, 11 different trails that were actually approved and that we could implement it. So it's a different size. It was not a vision of Enrique, but was the thing that we were allowed to do in order for people not only to have this fantastic ecosystemic reserve, which is beautiful, but actually to be able to walk around, not only to see it, but to walk around, but in this way. And finally, Latin America, for this discussion, we have different governance and institutional designs at the moment that might be useful for India, for example. India is not matching political decentralization. You're not even electing mayors in most cases. The governor of the state may or may not call for local elections. It's optional. That's a challenge. That's a challenge. But for example, Santiago de Chile now has the metropolitan region of Santiago de Chile. So previously 3 years ago, the capital of Chile, Santiago, was composed of 52 different small municipalities without any coordination about the 52. They decided 3 years ago that now we're going to have a regional governor elected, different from Bogota. That is elected in Bogota. The metropolitan region is not by election. So these are two different designs with the same purpose. It's very worth looking at them. How are they going to do? So we can learn. Mexico City did a big change. Mexico City was also, it's the largest city along with Sao Paulo in Latin America. And Mexico had delegations, 15 delegations, like the localities in Bogota, with appointed mayors, right? They just recently, less than 5 years ago, or a little bit more maybe, but recently, relatively, decided not to have appointed mayors, but elected mayors, and to elect also the mayor for the district, which is Claudia Sheinbaum, who's going to be the president. So it's at least a third different institutional design for coordination of different electoral bodies and territorial bodies. At least 3 different arrangements, different. And I think this is crucial. This is crucial for Africa. This is crucial for India to get to learn how to design these sort of collective governance territorial bodies for the sake of climate change, for the sake of social inclusion, and for the sake of economic development.
Thank you so much, Claudia. The last word, last 15 seconds to
Very,
Mauricio.
very quickly. No, just on participatory processes, and Quito actually has been following a similar process, what we call neighborhood assemblies for decision-making process, what kind of projects to fund with the participatory budgeting. But I wanted to share an interesting example of this kind of participatory processes. As mentioned, a large part of the territory of the metropolitan district of Quito is rural. And a part of it is actually in the rainforest. Even though Quito is a very high city, the urban area is 2,800 meters above the sea level, quite high. But since the territory is so huge, we have a great variety of land altitude within the territory. We have some rainforest areas. Some of those are very ecologically fragile, but very rich in terms of biodiversity. Some of those areas have been declared by UNESCO as world biosphere reserves. And in those areas, a lot of mining activity was taking place. And people, the majority of the local population were against that. So they voluntarily organize themselves to conduct a symbolic referendum within the community to decide whether they would support or not further mining activities. And the response was an overwhelming no. This was symbolic. But we decided to embrace that decision and make it not so symbolic. So we took it to the city council and we approved a resolution to make it official as something coming from the municipality of Quito, banning mining activities, which was not part of the legal authority of the city, but rather mining activities are ruled by the national government. But again, this had such a strong citizen message by people being empowered by the decision against mining that the government had no choice but to respect the people's decision. I think this is a great example of how important citizens' participation can become.
Well, what a great way of concluding our talk. Thanks so much to all of you for sticking around a little bit longer than perhaps expected. I want to say that you're all rewarded with dinners to go, which are in the next room. And as you can smell, it smells delicious. So please grab your dinner if you don't have plans already. And please join me in thanking our 2 guests for a wonderful. Thank you.